of states.
More like a league of friendship, right? That's what I've always heard it called.
Yeah, it didn't give the federal government a whole lot of power.
Not a lot of authority to work with.
No, not really. They could barely tax, they couldn't really regulate commerce, and enforcing any kind of national policy was a nightmare.
So basically, it was doomed to fail.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It quickly became clear that they needed a different approach, something more, I don't know, robust.
Something that could tie the states together more effectively.
Exactly. And that's where the Constitutional Convention comes in, 1787.
Yes. The birth of the Constitution.
A big one.
The document that's been, like, the foundation of U.S. governance for centuries.
And it's pretty incredible when you think about it, how they managed to create this system of checks and balances.
With power divided between the federal government and the state government.
Right. And at the same time, they outlined these fundamental rights for citizens.
It was a pretty groundbreaking document for its time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even with the Constitution, there were still some big issues that they just couldn't ignore, most notably the whole issue of slavery.
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Definitely. It was this huge point of contention.
Right.
Because you have this document that's supposed to be about freedom and equality, but at the same time, it allows for the continuation of slavery.
It's like this huge contradiction at the heart of the nation's founding.
It really is. And it had major consequences down the line. It's something they struggled with for decades.
It's a dark side of U.S. history that we can't ever forget, even as we celebrate the achievements.
Absolutely. So as the U.S. is expanding westward, right?
Fueled by this idea of manifest destiny.
Right. Manifest destiny.
Which, I've always found to be kind of a loaded term. What does it actually mean, like, in a practical sense?
It was basically this belief that America had a God-given right, a duty to expand its territory across the entire North American continent.
So from sea to shining sea.
Exactly. And it was used to justify a lot of things, westward expansion, obviously, but also the displacement of Native American populations.
And the Mexican-American War.
Exactly. It was a really complicated time because on the one hand, you have this sense of national pride, this belief in America's destiny.
Right, expanding its reach.
But on the other hand, it came at a huge cost.
For Native Americans, for anyone who stood in the way of that expansion.
Exactly. And the Mexican-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848, it really highlights this tension. The U.S. won, of course, gained all this territory, including California.
A huge land grab.
It was. But it also reignited this whole debate about the morality of expansion, especially the expansion of slavery.
Because that was always the underlying issue, wasn't it?
Always. And it's important to remember, too, that during all of this, amidst the westward expansion and the political wrangling, there were also these incredible social movements gaining traction.
Right, like the abolitionists and the suffragists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were fighting for a better, more just America.
Challenging the status quo.
Absolutely. And their efforts, they really laid the groundwork for a lot of the progress that we've seen since then.
It's inspiring to see how, throughout history, there have always been people willing to stand up for what they believe in, even when it was unpopular, even when it was dangerous.
Absolutely. It took a lot of courage to challenge those power structures.
So tell me more about some of those early movements. What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, the abolitionist movement, for example, they were fueled by this moral outrage over the horrors of slavery.
Understandably.
And they really gained momentum in the decades leading up to the Civil War.
Figures like Frederick Douglass, right?
Frederick Douglass.
Yeah.
Exactly. A former slave himself. He became this incredibly powerful speaker, a writer.
His autobiography is still so relevant today.
It's incredible.
A testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity.
For sure. And his speeches, they were electrifying. They really exposed the brutality of slavery.
I bet. And alongside the abolitionists, you had the women's suffrage movement gaining steam as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A pivotal moment for them was the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848.
Right.
They issued this declaration of sentiments demanding equal rights for women.
Including the right to vote.
Which was a radical idea at the time.
To say the least.
But they knew it was important.
And it's amazing to think about the courage it took for those women to stand up and challenge those deeply held social norms.
They faced a lot of opposition, both the abolitionists and the suffragists. But they were persistent. They knew they were on the right side of history.
And they paved the way for the progress that we've made since then, even if it's been a slow and often difficult journey.
100%. And those struggles for equality and justice, they continued into the 20th century, which was a time of massive transformation for the U.S.
The dawn of a new century, full of possibilities, but also a lot of uncertainty.
Exactly. You have the rise of the U.S. as a global power, but also two world wars, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement. It was a time of both incredible progress and, intense challenges.
It's kind of overwhelming to think about everything that happened in the 20th century alone.
It was a time of nonstop change, that's for sure.
For the U.S., it really marked this shift from being a regional power to becoming like a global superpower.
Right, and a lot of that had to do with their industrial might and, of course, their involvement in the two world wars.
And then, of course, there's the Cold War,
Right, which was basically this decades-long standoff with the Soviet Union.
where it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen.
It was a tense time. The threat of nuclear war, the space race, all that espionage and intrigue.
Like something out of a spy movie.
Totally. But, amidst all that tension, there were also some pretty amazing scientific and technological advances.
Right, like the space race itself.
Exactly. I mean, putting a man on the moon, that was huge. It really captured everyone's imagination and pushed the boundaries of what people thought was possible.
It led to all sorts of breakthroughs and everything from computing to materials, science.
And you can't forget about the social change that was happening here in the U.S. at the same time, especially the civil rights movement.
Which was, a pivotal moment in U.S. history.
It really was. Building on the legacy of those early abolitionists we talked about, the civil rights movement challenged this deeply rooted system of segregation and discrimination.
Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. really became symbols of hope and resistance during that time.
Absolutely. His message of nonviolent protest, his unwavering belief in equality, it really resonated with people.
And it led to some really significant legal changes, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Huge victories. But it's important to remember that the fight for true equality, it didn't end there.
Unfortunately not.
It's an ongoing process.
And it requires constant vigilance and action from all of us. And it wasn't just the civil rights movement that was reshaping the social landscape during this time, right?
Not at all. You also had the counterculture movement, the women's liberation movement, the environmental movement.
All these different groups challenging the status quo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And pushing for greater freedom, equality, and a more just society. It was a time of really intense self-reflection for the U.S.
So much change so quickly. It's hard to wrap your head around it all. But looking back at all these eras, all these pivotal moments, I guess it makes you wonder, where does it all leave us now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think the biggest takeaway is that the past, it's not really gone. It shapes who we are today, both as individuals and as a nation.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. We've seen how those historical threads we talked about, they run through everything from our political system to our social movements to the very fabric of our society.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
A lot.
From those early Paleo-Indians to European colonization, revolutions, civil war, social movements, and of course all the technological advancements and global conflicts.
It's a lot to take in.
But it's essential, right?
Yeah.
Because it helps us understand not just where we came from, but also where we're going.
Absolutely. Understanding our history, it gives us a better framework for understanding the present and navigating the future.
We talked about manifest destiny earlier, this idea of America's preordained path.
Right, but after everything we've discussed,
It makes you wonder, what does destiny even mean for a nation with such a complex and often messy past?
it's a question worth pondering.
Hmm.
And I think it speaks to the fact that history is never really finished. It's an ongoing narrative that we're all a part of.
That's a great note to end on. I feel like I've not just brushed up on some history, but I've gained this whole new appreciation for the forces that have shaped this nation.
That's what we were hoping for.
It's like having a backstage pass to the making of America, seeing all the twists and turns, the struggles and triumphs.
And it reminds us that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's alive, it's evolving,
Yeah.
and it's something that we all contribute to every single day.
Well said. I think that's going to do it for this deep dive into U.S. history. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's always more to explore.
Always.
So until next time, keep those questions coming and keep exploring the past because you never know what you might discover.
And you might just learn something new about yourself along the way.
Exactly. Thanks for listening.